Ready?
Sure.
Good evening and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, Diversifying Power with Jennie Stephens. My name is Deborah Hoffman and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Our speaker will do a 20 to 25 minute presentation and then she'll field questions. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube. Feel free to write your questions at any time, and then I'll read them at the end of the presentation. Jennie Stephens is a Northeastern University professor and author of the book, Diversifying Power. Over to you, Jennie.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Deborah. Great to be here. I'm going to share my screen. And I really appreciate having this opportunity to talk about my book and talk about some of the work that I do. And please, I know this can't be super interactive because of the format, but please do think about questions and write questions. And I will only talk for about half the time, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So this book is called Diversifying Power, Why We Need Antiracist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. And I've been working on climate and energy issues for my whole career, so the past 20, 25 years. And I actually have training in science and engineering, which is with a very technical perspective. But what I've realized is that we have been missing a lot of opportunities for responding to the climate crisis because we haven't been thinking about the social justice implications and the opportunities for investing in communities and households and in people as we confront the climate crisis. So I wrote this book that was just published in September, and it really brings together a lot of different ideas, and also it's really examples of innovative, inspiring leaders who are doing amazing creative things. So it's also a book that I hope will bring optimism and some inspiration to folks, because it's really there's a lot of potential for some real big changes. And I think now that we're in the pandemic, with such a disruptive time, it reminds us that a lot of the things we've been doing haven't really been working well for a lot of people. And we have an opportunity to kind of change the way we do things. With that introduction, I thought I would start by just telling you a little bit about myself. I have had a transdisciplinary career in climate and energy. And I have a dual citizenship. I was born and first lived in Dublin, Ireland, and my family moved to the Boston area when I was 8. I always knew I wanted to study and be involved professionally in environmental issues. And I got my undergraduate degree in kind of one of the first in the early 90s science policy environmental programs. And then I got my graduate degree in California, which was more technical in environmental science and engineering, and then came back to the Boston area to do energy policy work about energy innovation for climate. And then I taught at Clark University for 9 years, and then I taught at the University of Vermont. And then I've been at Northeastern here in Boston for the past 4.5 years. And Northeastern is a very innovative and interdisciplinary place, so it's fit really well. I'm actually the head of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern. And even though I have a science and engineering background, so very interdisciplinary, which is kind of what brings me to think about climate and energy in this different social and political way. So we don't always think about the climate crisis associated with economic injustice, but I start the book by really talking about the widening income and wealth gaps in the United States. This figure shows the past 40 years, how the top 1% has just been accumulating wealth. And with that has come also a concentration of power as well. And the wealthy have really been influencing our policies. And so we don't think of this, and this is happening not just in the United States, but it is worse in the United States and very pronounced in the United States. But what one idea here is that the polluter elite, who are kind of the really well-off people who have been profiting from our current system that does rely very heavily on fossil fuels and not on renewables, has for decades been investing in strategically to resist a transformation away from fossil fuels toward renewables. If you accept that, like, one of the major things that needs to happen to confront the climate crisis is we need to end our reliance on fossil fuels, move to a renewable-based society, there's been strategic resistance to that for decades that we're not all aware of. The ways that that resistance has manifested has been in investing in a misinformation campaign to deny climate science and confuse us about the risks of the climate crisis and the risks of burning fossil fuels and continuing our reliance on fossil fuels. They've also been investing in undermining public trust in government and also minimizing worker protections and worker rights. It used to be that companies and corporate entities were, proud of what they offered their employees. At this point, there's really been a culture shift, and a lot of companies are really prioritizing shareholders and minimizing how much they have to support their workers. So again, we don't always think of these issues connected to climate and energy, but given how much the elites have been influencing policy, there really is a connection here that I want to talk about more. So I propose that really the climate crisis is a crisis in leadership, and we need different kind of leadership and a kind of a different framing to think about the climate. Often the kind of conventional way that we've been thinking about climate in the policy space is in a very isolated way, a way that I call climate isolationism, which is kind of this narrow technocratic lens talking about decarbonization and greenhouse gas emission reductions, and very technological thinking, like, well, technology will save us if we just invest more money in the technology. And this is based on assumptions of kind of domination and control, and it's really missing opportunities for investing in people. And so what I propose is to broaden that and connect the climate crisis with everything else that people do actually wake up worrying about in terms of food and education and place to live and jobs and that kind of thing. And a way to think about that is this idea of energy democracy, which is about redistributing power, literally and figuratively. Instead of having these few multinational fossil fuel companies having such a hot, strong influence on our policies, our practices, our culture, there is potential to really have renewable-based society that is really transformative because of the power dynamics that are possible. If you think about, there really is renewable resources everywhere in the world. Every community, every region of the world has access to some solar and wind, and coastal communities also have offshore wind and wave and tidal energy. Inland communities also have geothermal energy, which is a really powerful source of energy that we have not invested a lot in. And so the reason this lens of energy democracy is so powerful and transformative is because renewable energy literally is free, abundant, plentiful. And so we move from an extractive and constraint-oriented fossil fuel economy to a regenerative economy. So, because once you've invested in the technology to leverage the sun or the wind, you actually have perpetual abundant energy. So energy democracy is really about broadening investments in people and communities, basing those investments on social justice and human dignity, and leveraging urgency for transformation, like acknowledging we have this climate crisis that we do need to respond to. If we invest in our communities, and particularly with renewable energy, there's a lot of potential for leveraging bigger power dynamic transformations. So chapter 1 of the book is called Growing the Squad, in which I really introduce this idea of anti-racist feminist leadership. And what I mean by that is leadership that recognizes these power dynamics and the concentration of wealth and power, and is trying continuously to resist that and redistribute power. And it's based on collaboration and inclusivity and participation, and really prioritizes what communities need, what workers need for a more prosperous and equitable future. And it focuses on reducing inequities and disparities by centering racial justice, economic justice, and social justice, and rather than the alternative kind of leadership, which is very patriarchal leadership, that is based on domination and exclusion, very intentionally excluding certain people, concentrating wealth and power by oppressing some people and not giving some people opportunities while others profit off of that. And that kind of patriarchal leadership also exacerbates inequities and disparities rather than reducing them. And as we have experienced in terms of the last 4 years in the United States, that kind of leadership also denies the problems that we have and says climate crisis isn't a problem to worry about. The pandemic isn't really that bad. We don't need to worry about. We don't have a structural racism. We don't have an economic crisis or a housing crisis, and kind of ignoring or dismissing these problems in order to sustain the status quo, because the status quo is working for the people who are currently profiting and from the systems that are in place. So you may have heard of the Squad, these 4 junior congresswomen. Ayanna Pressley represents us here in Massachusetts. And they really came on the national stage just over two and a half years ago, and totally changed the discussion on climate, because they were able to connect the climate crisis to jobs and economic justice, and connect it to racial justice and criminal justice reforms, and connect it to housing. So I think I find that new, refreshing kind of leadership very inspiring, and really what we need more of. So the rest of the book is really going through specific examples of inspiring leaders. One chapter is called Resisting the Polluter Elite, where I elevate the stories of different individuals and organizations that are being creative in how they're resisting the polluter elite. Jackie Patterson of the NAACP is the director of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program, and she and her team has done amazing work revealing how the fossil fuel industry has manipulated and communities, particularly Black communities, but sometimes even by offering them money to get support for fossil fuel infrastructure, which then has really debilitating, negative, devastating health impacts on those very same communities. Another leader is Jasmine Banks of Uncoke My Campus, and this organization is revealing how much the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel companies have been influencing our education system, and also our court system as well. And then Maura Healey, our Attorney General here in Massachusetts, is another leader that I elevate, who she has used the Massachusetts state laws about consumer protection to sue ExxonMobil, claiming that their advertising saying their fossil fuels are green is misleading consumer greenwashing. So the next chapter is about jobs and economic justice and elevating leaders that have been connecting climate and energy with jobs. Varshini Prakash is a really inspiring youth leader, the head of the Sunrise Movement that has really been so impactful in the past few years to push for more ambitious climate legislation, particularly working with in collaboration with and pushing Congress to come up with proposals like the Green New Deal. And Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is another leader who has been really pushing toward these innovative approaches to connecting the climate crisis and our response to that climate crisis with creating jobs and workforce training. And these other leaders that I mentioned in this chapter, Erica Mackey is the head of Grid Alternatives, which is an organization that is installing solar panels in communities that are been underinvested in, and then they're also creating workforce training, renewable installation training so that people can join the workforce in this new sector. Esteban Kelly is a leader of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, and he's done some really innovative work on trying to explore the possibilities of solar companies being worker-owned cooperatives rather than conventional business model. And Rowena Altmos is a leader here in Boston, the head of All In Energy, who is similarly doing workforce training on energy efficiency jobs, because energy efficiency, those jobs and incentives have also gone disproportionately to well-off communities and families and households. And she's working to change that by broadening the workforce in energy efficiency jobs. So all of these leaders are resisting the kind of economic precarity that we've become accustomed to, reclaiming the potential for public investments and really focusing on restructuring for much more inclusive economic prosperity. The next chapter is about leaders who are connecting climate and energy to health, well-being, and nutritious food for all. Robert Bullard is often considered the father of environmental justice. He's among the first researchers to point out that the health impacts of so much of our industrial and fossil fuel infrastructure are disproportionately impacting Black communities and other more vulnerable communities. And Mildred McLean is an activist in Harambee House, Citizens for Environmental Justice. She's among the Black women who have been saying, we are sick and tired of being sick and tired. Another leader is Gina McCarthy, who is also a Massachusetts local native. She is currently the White House National Climate Advisor. She was also the head of EPA under Obama, and before that, in between, also the head of NRDC. But she is an advocate, climate advocate, who has been pushing for connecting the climate crisis with health and public health for a long time. And in response to that, many communities around the country and around the world have declared that the climate crisis is a health emergency, public health emergency. Jillian Heshaw is a lawyer and an advocate for Black farmers, and she's been doing really interesting work advocating for and connecting agriculture with climate action. Mustafa Santiago Ali is the head of involved in the National Wildlife Federation, and he is really an advocate for Black communities, particularly with the disparate impacts to vulnerable communities with climate impacts. And Dorcetta Taylor is a researcher who's done a lot of work documenting how the environmental community has been so white, the whiteness of the environmental community, and how that has minimized the attention to health impacts and the disparate racial health impacts we see with so many environmental issues. And Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, I include in this chapter because she has also demonstrated leadership related to the coronavirus and the spread of managing the pandemic. she and other leaders of several countries that have been very effective in managing the pandemic, women leaders who have been effective include the leader of Taiwan, Germany, and Denmark as well. And all of those leaders seem to have taken, strict, evidence-based, ambitious measures, and then coupled that with communication to the people that's empathetic and compassionate about why these strict measures are important, not just for your own health or the health of your family, but for the health of the country or the community. So we need more leaders like that to act on climate and connect. Transportation is another area. Another chapter of the book is really focused on climate, energy, and leaders that are connecting climate and energy with transportation, going beyond electric vehicles. We know electric vehicles are great, but they're really not accessible to everybody. And we need to, especially when we think about transit equity, we need to broaden the conversation about transportation and the investments that we need to make. And Representative Ayanna Pressley has been really a leader in focusing on transit equity at the national level. And Michelle Wu, who is Boston City Councilor, now running for mayor of Boston, she has developed a Green New Deal for Boston that includes the proposal to make the buses and subways free. And that sounds like a radical proposal, yet, we assume and we expect that most of our roads and bridges are free, right? The car transportation, but for some reason we have this different model for public transit, and the potential for public transit to kind of equalize and help break down some of the economic barriers and disparities that we have in the city of Boston, the greater Boston area, is really great. So there's a lot of potential there for different kind of social innovation rather than technological innovation in financing of transportation options. And I also mentioned Greta Thunberg here, the youth leader who internationally really inspired a lot of young people to be involved in protesting and and resisting the lack of action on the climate crisis. And she demonstrated some, leadership, innovative leadership in when she was coming over from Europe to North America for a series of international climate meetings. She didn't fly. She took a wind-powered sailboat both directions across the Atlantic. And another chapter that I elevate and talk about leaders who are connecting climate and energy with housing. And particularly with the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, we really have a housing crisis in the United States. And Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota has really been among the leaders really elevating the need for public investment in housing. There's a group called Moms for Housing that formed in Oakland, California. And this group was responding to an event that happened with 4 women who are mothers who were housing insecure, didn't have a place to live. And there are these empty houses in Oakland that a developer had bought and hadn't sold yet. And they occupied the empty vacant home. And when they were evicted from the home, when the authorities came, they came with militarized tanks and guns to evict these women and children out of the home. And that experience catalyzed them forming this organization called Moms for Housing to really elevate the crisis that so many mothers and families are in, and really prioritizing and introducing the idea that housing should really be a human right, and that this problem is going to keep getting worse until we figure out some strategies for investing more in housing for people. The last example here is some Indigenous women in Canada that have been resisting the building of the Trans-Canada pipeline, a fossil fuel pipeline. They call themselves the tiny house warriors. So they have built these tiny houses on wheels, and then they've lived in them and moved them to block the construction on the pipeline. So it's a creative and innovative way to connect with their cultural association with the land as their home, by also connecting with these tiny houses that they use as a form of protest. So that's a kind of broad overview of the book. And I end the last chapter with some specific actions that we can all take to get involved in leveraging our own power and our collective power for transformation, for the kinds of changes that we need in society. And I start this by really acknowledging that we're all leaders. When a book about leadership is not only about, elected officials and CEOs of companies. We're leaders in our communities, we're leaders in our organizations or our families, and we can really all get involved and act to inspire others to be leaders. And it's really also about advocating for systems change, not just incremental changes. Like, we're at a point where we realize that these are systemic challenges that we're facing. So that's a different kind of advocacy it's kind of a paradigm shift that we can all kind of embrace. We also can all get involved in understanding and unlearning racism and sexism, talk about racism and sexism, acknowledge and resist and explore it in our day-to-day lives, in our organizations that we're affiliated with. There's so much that we need to continue to do all that kind of work. Voting and helping others to vote is obviously really important, and we all have the opportunity to engage with our elected officials. We all really need to prioritize diversity, equity, inclusion everywhere in everything we do. We all have the opportunity to advocate for local community renewable energy in our own communities. And we can leverage data, science, and information to justify the kinds of bigger changes that are really needed. We can also support cooperatives and credit unions and different novel economic structures rather than the big corporate entities that keep getting bigger and controlling more and more. So supporting different kinds of and local economies as well. And finally, I'll just mention, obviously, our country is very divided right now. So we need to be open to listening and learning from each other and understanding each other and not villainizing each other. I mentioned in this last chapter of the book, Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, and she's really a climate justice activist and advocate on the international level. And she, what we're talking about here really shouldn't be thought of as radical. She calls it just a people's first approach, right? Like, if we prioritized what people need and then, figured out ways to support what people need and a people's first approach, that's really all we need to do. And I end also by honoring Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to run for president in the United States in 1972. And in some ways, we've come a long way since 1972, and in other ways, we still have a long way to go. So I think I will end there. I will just mention, I do have a Twitter account and a website if anyone's interested in learning more about other things, projects and initiatives that I'm involved in. I also will just say that all the author proceeds from this book go to NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program. So if you are interested and end up buying a copy of the book, the author proceeds go to continuing and advancing and supporting the innovative work that organization is doing. So with that, I'd be happy to take questions and respond to whatever would be helpful. Thank you.
And thank you. Thank you so much, Jenny. There were so many things that you said that really jumped out at me, but I really like that sort of people's first approach as a way of just framing what we need to do and how we need to view our system. It's not just a climate issue, but it's a whole system issue. So we do have a couple questions for you. One person says, it's painfully clear that only one political party is willing to deal with climate issues. We can't get anything done unless we elect good candidates and fight voter suppression and gerrymandering. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so the divisiveness and the partisanship is difficult and frustrating. And at the same time, I think, this is a time of optimism, I think, in some ways, because we see more and more younger politicians, more diverse politicians who bring different experiences, different priorities, different life experiences to the positions. And so I know our political landscape is still very divided and very even between these two dominant parties. And I think the writing is on the wall, so to speak, in terms of the opportunities for and the desperate need for public investments to confront the pandemic and the suffering that's going on in related to all the disruptions from that, coupled with climate disruptions like what happened in Texas last week, is a prime example of not prioritizing and not preparing ourselves for what we know is going to happen. So Texas, is a state that is led primarily by climate deniers. And so they just ignored and pretended like, oh, we won't get that extreme weather, even though 10 years ago they had a similar situation, right? But they just thought, we'll just pretend that it's not there and it won't happen again. But even though it was inevitable that it would happen again, and it will happen another time, right? And it might even happen more frequently, because that's the pattern with the climate crisis, is there's more frequent and intense weather events of all kinds. So they're unpredictable, but it's predictable that there will be some, right? So when we deny that, it's getting harder and harder to deny it, right? And the real consequences of the denial result in these really difficult and suffering situations. So again, yes, the partisanship is a real issue, and I think I'm optimistic that we are starting to see a shift in the direction of acknowledgement that we have to, and it's our survival at this point, right? And so it's getting more and more serious, and it will be harder and harder to continue to deny the climate crisis.
That is definitely true. Let's see, a comment. It's very generous of you to handle your author proceeds that way. And that person also wants you to talk a little bit about your teaching.
Yeah, so I teach a course called Energy, Democracy, and Climate Resilience, which focuses on some of these same kind of bringing together these issues in a way that goes beyond the technology and connects with the kind of social and political dimensions of what's happening and what the possibilities are. So I teach at Northeastern, I teach undergraduate students from a variety of different majors take that class, and I also teach graduate students. We have multiple master's programs in environmental science and policy, and in other forms of public policy and energy policy and climate policy. So, and I also work with PhD students who are learning how to do research. So full spectrum of my teaching in terms of the different kinds of students that I engage with. But students are, so passionate about learning about and understanding these issues. So it's really inspiring to work with students, and my classes tend to be discussion based, and we also do projects, and often working with external organizations, community organizations sometimes, that are doing projects in these spaces on climate and energy, and then it gives the students opportunities to engage with what's happening on the ground as we're learning. And that's also a characteristic of Northeastern in terms of the experiential learning that we do. So
the co-op system. Yeah.
Yep. And the co-op system.
Cool. Yep. This person says, I recently heard a podcast about disparate impacts of climate change on non-Western countries. Can you speak more about the global perspective and how our leaders can be more aware of this?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, the book is definitely a US focused kind of perspective. And most of the examples, not all, but most of the examples of the innovative leaders that I showcase in the book are domestic. And the question, one of the things I've realized as giving talks about the book, and in this virtual world, I actually give international talks as well, that the ideas and the examples are inspiring in other contexts as well, right? So I just saying that up front, but more explicitly to the question about the disparate impacts of climate in different parts of the world. And what's also really important to think about, it's not just the impacts, but who's contributing most to the climate crisis are the richer countries that have burned more fossil fuels, right, than other countries. So there's quite a lot of inequities and this is the climate justice issues internationally that are really challenging, because most of the people who are already suffering the most from climate are the people who have not been contributing as much, right? And so some of the very acute examples are like Bangladesh, for example, where the sea level rise is such that the flooding in Bangladesh is becoming almost so predictable and drastic, and that people are having to move. There's also islands in the South Pacific that are the whole countries are going to have to be moved. And so there's already climate catastrophe in many places. And this is a point that, some of us, the kind of general narrative is still like, oh, we only have 10 more years or 20 more years, or, and then it's going to get really bad. It's already really bad in a lot of places. And people are adapting, and people are and people are also suffering and dying and moving, and a lot of different impacts. So I think we need to, leaders here need to acknowledge that, and we have a responsibility, being among the countries that has contributed the most to the climate crisis in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. You could argue that we should have more responsibility, and we should be accelerating and leading the way. And we did have a leadership position in this space, sort of on and off again in the international landscape. And now with the Biden-Harris administration, they are really trying to ramp up our leadership, but it's playing a lot of catch up, because we're really not leaders anymore in this area. So that's obviously disappointing, and but there's a lot of potential for bigger change. And that's again where this idea of more transformative change comes in. And we need to be thinking more drastically about this, not just, oh yeah, it's off in the future, we'll deal with it later, right? Like we're no longer there. We're in it. And it would have been nice in the 70s when Carter put solar panels on the White House and then Reagan came in and took them down. If things had gone differently in the 70s, we could be in a very different place right now than we actually are.
Yeah. I have two more questions for you.
Great.
This is one that a friend of mine texted me. How can I get past the worry that including all the ancillary social issues ends up detracting from a more focused investment in science-based energy transformation efforts?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. I think there's two ways to think about this, and I've struggled with this as well, right? There's an urgency, right, for real change quickly, and we know we need to wean ourselves from fossil fuels, so like we should be doing what we need to do to get that, and I think that is a focus, and I think we should stay focused on that. The flip side is, and the other way to think about it is, we've known that for decades and we've been completely ineffective at doing it. So it hasn't worked. And I've been, trained in working with many of the experts in this area, and they've been proposing this and that, and none of it has worked. And I don't mean the technologies haven't worked. The technology does work. And that's kind of the point. We have the technology to do it. It's more of the social and the political side that we really need to work on. So the other way to think about it is, if we're too narrow, just saying climate is a catastrophe, we have to focus all our energy on climate, it ends up, it could be, you could argue, and this is kind of what I try to argue in the book, is that's not effective because people all around the world have lots of other things they're also worried about, right? Like jobs, like housing and food. And so if you try, just like don't connect the dots, and you end up also not being inclusive, and you also exclude people from even worrying about it, because a lot of people can't wake up every day worrying about carbon emissions, right? Because that's not what's most acute for them, and they're worried about paying the rent or paying the bills, and where their kids are going to go to school and how they're going to stay healthy. So that's where this broader approach the argument is that without a broader approach, we're actually not going to be effective. So we need to broaden things. And if you think about the pandemic, for example, right now, it's clear that we need some big public investments to help people right now, right? Like there's so many people suffering economically and health-wise, and the government has to step in. And when we do that, we don't have to call it climate policy, but we can, if we're going to rebuild the energy infrastructure in Texas, for example, we can accelerate the renewables. If we were going to build new housing for the homeless people, we can make sure those are zero carbon, super energy efficient. So it's more about focusing on people, what people need, and then in those policies, integrating in the climate energy that makes sense. And then that's where the argument can be that the case can be made that then that will lead to more impactful climate energy action. So it's almost like if we focus on social justice and people, maybe the climate will be a co-benefit rather than the other way around, right? If you just focus on climate, you're kind of saying, oh, well, maybe these other things will either go away or get better, but they might not, right? And so some people have an urgency about climate. Other people actually have much more urgency about social justice. And so you can think about it together, and you can think about it prioritizing one with the other being a co-benefit, or prioritizing one and the other being a co-benefit. Either way works. And so it's both and, it's not either or. Yeah.
Got it. That makes sense. Okay, let's see. This person says the fracked gas industry is selling itself as clean, even though shifting to gas with fracking and pipelines will cement our climate health disaster. Democrats are even split on this. What are your thoughts? And this is from someone who lives in Pennsylvania, where fracking is big.
Yep.
And this person also says that they agree completely with what you just said. We are in it now, but people are often overwhelmed just getting by to think about this.
Absolutely.
So anyway, back to the question about the fracked gas industry.
Yeah. So fracking was a technological innovation, I guess, right? 10, 15 years ago, where the United States realized we have all this additional fossil fuels that we can now extract that we thought we couldn't have access to. And so it was part of this kind of boom bust cycle with fossil fuels that's quite repetitive in terms of different extractions over the years. And it has not been, there's been so much pressure to and support policy-wise to leverage that, extract that gas, get it in, out into the international market, as well as keeping costs low domestically. And communities around the country have suffered as a result, because the regulations really have not protected the communities, and even the promise of jobs and economic prosperity in those communities has not been fulfilled to the degree that a lot of communities were told they would benefit more than they have. And then the negative implications, as the question pointed to, are numerous, right? In terms of health and environmental destruction and a whole series of risks and negatives. So you may have noticed in the last election, and this is happening over and over, that fossil fuels and particularly fracked gas, and coal has become like the crux of actually what all of our partisan politics centers around, right? Like, actually, this is the $1 million question, or the biggest issue almost, in that, and that it's really hard for politicians who want to gain support from lots of constituents who are relying on fossil fuel jobs to take a firm stance and say we need to end fossil fuel reliance. But we're getting, with each election and with each cycle and with each, we're getting closer, and more are acknowledging that this has to happen, and it has to be done well. And I think the biggest part, and I think what the Obama administration has actually been criticized for, is with the reduction in coal and coal-related jobs during the Obama years, it was a lost opportunity not to invest heavily in those communities for alternative livelihoods, right? And because there was no alternatives, it was just seen as like a negative, like, you're taking away our jobs and there's no other option for us. So it's a negative, like it's a lose-lose, right? And if there had been more strategic investments in those communities to replace and retrain and workforce development, or new industry, or new job opportunities, then that level of deep, politically then harnessed, divisive political landscape, so all focusing on fossil fuels wouldn't have manifest as deeply as it has. And so the past few election cycles, we've just seen this continue. And this time wasn't as much with the coal, although coal also, but with this election, more with the frack gas, as the question points out. But ultimately, we do need to move away from all fossil fuels. So, but it's hard because we're so dependent on fossil fuels.
Right. Great. Well, thank you. I think that's our final question, and so we should probably call it a night. But I want to thank you so much for sharing your book with us, and all of the knowledge that you have about sort of creating this whole new lens with which to look at our climate problem.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Jenny, if you want to stay on, we can chat for a couple minutes.
Okay, great.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.